for my birthday, my stepson gave me this picture of me reading James Joyce to my grandkids.
Oh, wow.
James Joyce wrote a children's story for his grandson, Stephen, that was published as The Cat and the Devil. And I had bought a copy of that for my grandmother just before she died. Like in '86, I bought it for her. And so I've read that now to all my grandkids. And so it's cool. My one granddaughter, when she was in college, she was reading James Joyce. I said, remember, I used to read you James Joyce. And she looked at me and I pulled out The Cat and the Devil. She said, I remember that.
Holy cow. I didn't know you had kids, much less grandkids.
Yeah, two stepkids, 5 grandkids, a great granddaughter, and another great grandson on the way in October.
Wow. Wow. I've got 2 teenage boys, so I'm in my own little world there.
That's an education.
Yeah, one's going to college in a month or 2, so we're just entering a whole new phase. Well, I don't know what, I don't have anything too formal, or didn't think maybe this would take too long, but it takes what it takes. I just, I think this is an exciting topic, which to me is, where was Bob going with Tale of the Tribe? And when you said you couldn't make it, I wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on that. Now, I remember I spoke to you about this in person at the memorial, which was whatever, 15 plus years ago, somewhere around there. And, we've got this information in the back of SOG, and we've got the MLA classes, the ideogram class and the Tale of the Tribe class. But I don't know that there's much else out there. And I guess the question I brought up to you back at the memorial is, do you think there is a book out there? And your response to me at the time was that you didn't really think there was much material on the topic, if I recall correctly. Does that sound right?
Yes, sir. And I've changed my perspective a bit.
Okay.
I love Charles Rosen's books, The Romantic Generation. And he talks in there about how for the Romantics, the fragment became an art form. And so rather than mourning the absence of a book-length text of the Tale of the Tribe, I choose to see that fragment at the end of SOG as a wonderful, complete thing. It says oxymoron, but a complete fragment.
Yeah.
And one thing, looking at the Tale of the Tribe course and people's disappointment that it dealt so much with Pound and Joyce, I think about Bob's notion that Pound and Joyce tried to create the internet on paper.
Right.
But you could see the Cantos, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake as early models of the internet. Particularly, and you can see this in Pound's editing of The Wasteland as well, you have this notion going back to Aristotle of the unities of time, place, and action. The idea that if you had a 3-hour play, it should only cover 3 hours. They should not be able to travel any further than they could actually travel in those 3 hours. And 420 years ago, people gave Shakespeare a hard time for not following the unities. He doesn't follow the unities in any of his plays except for Comedy of Errors and The Tempest. When Eliot wrote The Wasteland, he has these radical jumps. And one thing that Pound did when he edited The Wasteland was to cut out the transitions, saying, you can just jump. Very much like our idea of we click on something today. And this is interesting. This is happening right as cinema's happening. And D.W. Griffith starts having these, cutting as a means of telling a story. And you think about a movie like, I'm forgetting it, the Bruce Willis movie, science fiction movie, Fifth Element, where you cut from ancient Egypt to the future. Or James Bond movies, where we cut from Venice to a space satellite, to Hong Kong, to New York. You and I have grown up with this is very natural. This shocked people when Eliot and Pound did this. One of the things that people really upset with about the Cantos is that he jumps all over the place. And so you could sort of see that the Cantos has hyperlinks. He is jumping, he is showing everything. And Joyce is doing this hologrammatically in Finnegan's Wake. So rather than, I used to think of Tale of the Tribe as being these 10 or 11 individuals sort of equal. You could sort of see them as hubs. So, and I think about the essay Beckett wrote on Finnegan's Wake, relating Joyce to Beckett, I'm sorry, to Bruno and Vico. So you can sort of see Bruno and Vico definitely leading to Joyce. Fenellosa definitely leads to Pound. Korzybski definitely points to Fuller. So now you have sort of, it's almost like an atomic model that this Tale of the Tribe functions. And so I think about Georges Andrelet's notion about information doubling. And one thing I find very interesting about the generation of Pound and Joyce is that they lived through information doubling. Nobody else in history up to that point had actually lived through that long. So Pound, born in 1885, the Wild West, lives to see the first moon landing. So he has to process 2 world wars, his own horrible choices, re Mussolini and Hitler, and anti-Semitism, and a world which was changing so much. And in some ways, you can sort of see him trying to process this.
Nice. I like, I'm trying to process all this. But if you go back to just the fragment as an art form, to me, that really even right there talks about an ideogram as like a fragment as an art form. That just to circle back. And when well, I'll tell you what I see when I parse through, what is it, like these 12 players that he brings up in SOG at the end there for this Tale of the Tribe thing. It seems like he's hinting at 2 things. He discusses a critique of language from several folks, you know, from Nietzsche and Vico and Korzybski, et cetera, but also the idea of language as class warfare. So it's kind of a critique of language as creating kind of, as I put it together, creating hierarchy and class warfare, perhaps, or maybe it's just, maybe language is helping crystallize those things in place. But then there's this talk about a decentralized universe. And so going from linear alphabetic structural language to kind of a decentralized, dynamic, hologrammic, feedback-based. He talks about Korzybski as critiquing the English language as, I forget the specifics, but basically says we need something more like math, a mathematical language structures. And you were mentioning, you know, so to the extent you say Joyce and Pound are creating the internet on paper, the other one that he sneaks in there that I can't quite wrap my head around, but I kind of get it, is Bucky Fuller's synergetic sociology. And I'm not sure what he means by that because I just don't know Bucky Fuller that well, but it's like there's half of what he's saying is like, look, we've got these language structures, which I think is what Bob was all about in a big way. It was like attacking language and in my mind at least, but kind of critiquing language as class warfare, and then looking at like some kind of decentralized, dynamic, hologrammic, maybe even mathematical and science-based feedback, decentralized universe. Yeah, so that's what I'm putting together in all this, or trying to articulate somehow.
Well, I remember, man, it's like 1999. Bob said he had started reading Fuller's Synergetics online a few pages a day. And he thought it revealed the actual structure of universe. So
the book Synergetics, is that?
Yeah, which provide, I've never finished it, but I sort of Bucky's mathematical structure. Okay. And So the question comes, what do we use to analyze universe? And as you mentioned, Korzybski noticed that the things that have changed rapidly in the last 500 years often have to do with technology based on mathematics, so that the structure of mathematics seems more isomorphic with reality than ordinary language structures.
Wow.
So that the calculus you use to build a bridge that doesn't fall down, or to make this Zoom session, provides a great deal of success. And if you look at the US Constitution or the King James Bible, two language structures which many people revere, you might wonder whether they prove as reliable a structure as the mathematics which provide the access to the Zoom call or to the bridges that we drive over, usually without thinking about them.
Wow, that's pretty big deal. So mathematics is more in line with reality than language.
Oh, and again, let's try the E prime thing. Mathematics provides structures which enable us to build structures which seem to survive testing rigorously. In that, I think you look like Mike Gathers in a way very, very different from an astral projection I might have of meeting the goddess Athena. You know, I've tried that. It does not come over as crystal clear as this image of you in yellow with that door behind you and the glyph of Robert Anton Wilson's spiral on the whiteboard. Okay, this vividness does not match my astral projection. Now, again, it could have to do with my weakness at astral projection, or that mathematics provides a really powerful tool for building technologies. And going back to Vico and class warfare, so much of this has been shaped by our economic structure. As the philosopher Huey Lewis said, we're taking what they're given because we're working for a living.
To quote Huey Lewis, the great Huey Lewis. So, so you might say math models reality more accurately than language.
Or at least in a way that we can test with incredible rigor. Okay, so if we say there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, I don't know that I have the means of testing that so well as when I drive on the 15 freeway and get on the 91 expressway, that high concrete ramp that I go over holds up really, really well. And and again, despite the corruption of government contractors, et cetera, the engineers who worked and built that have made it so it stood up over a ton of cars.
Right. So there's something about it stands up, mathematics stands up to the rigor of the scientific method. It's testable and repeatable, more so than the English language, which has got all kinds of little potholes and pitfalls to get hung up in.
And Bob Wilson suggested that America, or the United States of America, accrued incredible wealth in large part because of its First Amendment that allowed free exchange of ideas, which allowed for much greater development because capitalists realized in the 18th century that they could accrue more wealth by utilizing new technologies. And again, you can see this analyzed in great detail in Bob's Historical Illuminatus series when we compare the atmosphere of the Inquisition-dominated Italy and France versus the radically more free in terms of communication England and the even more radically free developing United States of America, looking from 1760 up to 1790.
Right. But so what just hit me there is like the free exchange of ideas. So there's something about opening up the flow of information that leads to more benefit for all, I guess I'll say.
And again, I think of, Ezra Pound seems like such a troubling individual, but he said peace comes of adequate information.
Mm.
And Pound, again, Tale of the Tribe mentions Claude Shannon, who has this notion of information coming from the negative reciprocal of predictability. And certainly in Pound and Joyce, you have radically unpredictable texts.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's something, and is Claude Shannon right up there's something, yeah, that information theory, information equals surprise equation, so to speak, which I don't know is directly in the write-up, but he talks about information theory. And the one that comes out for me that I don't know gets enough attention is feedback. It's like when we were talking about hierarchies, they were talking about the snafu principle, where communication can only take place among equals. And in a hierarchical situation, you don't have that equality. You have that kind of, I'm going to tell my boss or the higher up on the hierarchy what I think they want to hear, not what I think they need to hear, let's say. And that really, just that's this idea of feedback as essential, something I'm still playing with, I guess.
And in terms of the First Amendment, perhaps Mr. Hendricks' discourse on feedback at Woodstock, playing the national anthem, might help us navigate wherever the heck it is we're going.
You want to say more about that? What do you mean by that?
I think about, the signaling that we see, whether it is Trump hats or neighbors with Trump flags, American flag pins or their absence, kneeling at football games, amplified through media. And again, in the Tale of the Tribe, he talks about Mr. McLuhan.
Yeah.
Michael Johnson, if you are out there, America needs to hear you. Okay. Mr. Johnson, or Dr. Johnson, has pursued McLuhan with much greater depth than I have. I think he's read everything by McLuhan.
I've asked Michael for a 3-page write-up on this by tomorrow. I'm hoping to put a deadline on him. We'll light a fire under him, but I don't know that we're going to succeed in that regard.
And again, the issue of economics, I remember reading somebody in some Wilson fan group blaming Bob for the death of Luna, saying that if he hadn't quit Playboy, he would have lived in a nicer neighborhood and she probably would have lived.
Wow.
And the issues of economics, how we do this, how the Da Vinci Code sells so many copies and Bob struggles to exist. Brilliant writers like Dr. Johnson do not have people paying them to write what they write.
No, I think that lights me up, and I'll tell you. So I think, this idea of the medium of the message, and we have this internet which runs on TCP/IP, decentralized protocol, and it's something that I can't really get into in great detail, but there was a lot of promise behind that. And then we ended up where we are now with social media and just a divided world. I'm not prepared to really offer a bulletproof thesis here on this, but I have been down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and I believe Bitcoin is going to change consciousness. It is the economic structure that runs on a decentralized internet layer that I believe is going to bring economic equality. Now, it's really popular to shit on Bitcoin these days, and there's a lot to it. I mean, when you get into money and macroeconomics, there's a lot to it. And I think we're basically, when you talk about Bitcoin, you're looking at like the internet in 1993 right now, kind of the equivalent of that. It is just so primitive, and it's easy for people to dismiss it, and it just hasn't matured as a technology. But the structure of Bitcoin, I believe, is going to revolutionize economics in a profound way, a deeply profound way. And I believe personally, this is going to change the consciousness of the planet. It is going to provide this decentralized universe that we've been waiting for. That's my bias, but I'm sticking with it. God damn it. Anyhow, I just have to bring that up. That's my current high horse to stand on. So I'm happy to answer anything you would like to talk about regarding Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, but I want to just kind of take the time to really pick your brain if there's more you would like to say about the tale of the tribe and all of this, and where you think it's going, or where you think Bob was going with all that. What do you what's on your mind?
Wow, there's so many different things. In terms of Bitcoin, I think about Bob wrote a bit about encryption algorithms, and somewhere he talks about that in Pynchon. And
there's a few audio clips you can find where he talks about early cryptocurrency that was kind of being developed in the 90s when he was paying attention to those kind of things. There's also a quote about basically Bitcoin, which is just having the accounting journals online so everybody can see it, which is what Bitcoin is, a decentralized ledger, among other things, that's online for everybody to see. It's anonymous because you can't necessarily know what address points to what bank account or what person, for example. But all the transactions are documented and they're all online, and anybody can, right now I'm working with my son. We've got a Raspberry Pi, which is basically a tiny microcomputer, and we're setting it up to be a Bitcoin node, which is basically, it holds the code that Bitcoin runs on, and it holds the ledger. And so it'll just be one more of a, thousands of nodes out there that help to create this decentralized network. For $200 or whatever it is, suddenly we're a keeper of the code.
And that points to the importance of these maybe day gatherings that Bobby has done and that you have done. A tendency, I think, occurs certainly in myself to get very egotistical about, this is how Bob wanted these things, this is what Bob meant, blah, 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 blah. And I have found it humbling to watch these very bright people the last two maybe days and see, well, they've taken a lot of the same data and gone in very different directions. And I think about, I think it's in Schrodinger's cat, Bob talks about the parallels between Aleister Crowley and Lewis Carroll. And that they both seem to have encountered these different external intelligences, but they took the flavor of the consciousness they passed through. So the Book of the Law took a Crowley-esque flavor. Alice in Wonderland took a Charles Dodson and Lewis Carroll-ish flavor. And so based on our own different gifts and backgrounds, setting, if you will, we've all gone off in these different directions based on these powerful impetus of the Wilson works or the Leary works, etc. And so I think about you with your career shift from engineering into counseling, your deep involvement with Antero, and all these other things, you've gone a different direction. Steve Fly has gone in a very different direction. Oz Fritz has gone in a very different direction. Tom Jackson, Michael Johnson, all these different people have taken these and gone in different directions and done different things with them. And just as people may think, I overemphasize certain things, I may think some of these people overemphasize certain things, but, we're sort of all dealing with this decentralized universe. and again, what texts we can deal with to try to navigate them. I don't read mathematics very well, certainly not as well as I did 40 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, I started off college as a math major. I found it very humbling. In the 90s, I went back and tried to take a chaos math class in school. When you stop doing math every day, it
Yeah.
fades from consciousness. And I found this interesting. I just finished rereading Finnegan's Wake, and I've spent a lot of time with that text over the last 40 years. But if you don't do it every day, you know, it sort of fades a bit. And so it's there. And I have these things I connect with. I haven't read the Canos for all the way through for 18 years. You know, I think about languages. I don't read Latin and German every day. My Latin and German are weaker than they were. You know, Robert Heinlein talked about trying to keep up with scientific literature and saying, the faster I go, the behinder I get. From Alice in Wonderland. And again, if you think about the idea of extended lifespans, coming to, and I think this came up in our last interview, I didn't finish it. One of the final exercises, maybe the last exercise in Prometheus Rising, says, if you're going to live to 300, you know, what arts do you want to enjoy? What sciences do you want to learn? So the thing becomes this: as we get older, what stays current? What new learning technologies are we going to have? You know, in James Joyce's The Dead, Gabriel Conroy says he wants to go on a bicycle tour through France and Germany to keep up with the languages, to keep them current in his brain. And the idea is, you know, what do we do to try to navigate the world that we're living through? And, you know, what is going to stay in our consciousness, what fades as we try to navigate. Wilson and Leary both frequently wrote about how people tend to have these powerful imprint experiences up through their teenage years. And that nervous system then deals with the rest of reality. There's this idea that Nixon was living out Teapot Dome as he lived through Watergate.
Oh, wow.
I know for me, watching these January 6th hearings, I find myself activating these childhood memories of Watergate. And of course, as a Joycean, January 6th marks the Feast of the Epiphany, the setting for Joyce's The Dead. And I find it interesting that Finnegan's Wake has this large trial scene near the end, as does Alice in Wonderland. So these two great dream narratives have these trials. And so I think about the characters of James Joyce undergoing these January 6th hearings. You know, are the January 6th hearings really about James Joyce and the Feast of the Epiphany and the Dead? No, I don't think so. But for me, as a Wilson head and a Wilsonian, I process the information that way.
That's interesting with current gas prices and what looks like an inflationary decade just getting started. I have flashbacks to when I was a kid in the 70s and gas rationing. I remember my dad would, when the car got to half a tank, he would go get another tank again or fill it up. And I like, why are you doing this? And it was, I forget his answer, but the idea is, you know, we're rationing gas. We've got gas shortages. We've got high prices, and it's just what I'm doing right now. And all that has been top of mind for me recently, given our current economic and energy climate. And what really struck me, what you were talking about earlier, this hit home when I was chatting with Adam Gorightly for the Hilaritas pod, but how they were creating this Discordian religion and kind of passing around this document in the kind of this decentralized manner, passing it around amongst all these people and adding to it and kind of just ad hoc arranging it and sending around these zines. And it seemed like Bob Wilson would love to write letters, and he would always include a bunch of like Discordian propaganda with each letter. But they kind of created through the mail system and through this kind of Discordian philosophy that was underpinning what they were writing about. They created like this pre-internet internet. Just fascinating to think about these things. It is to me, at least, and how they almost create, you know, the medium is the message. They kind of used the mail system to create a proto, obviously slower and not as accessible internet. Anyway, so many directions we could go here. So I'm happy to just keep chatting with you. I got no deadlines, but.
And that again, that this tale of the tribe fragment there pushes us in so many directions.
Mm-hmm.
I know I don't have the obsession with it that I once did, but I really did back in before 1910, let's say. I really poured over that. I remember we went through interlibrary loan to get all of Francis Yates's books.
Oh, wow.
It seemed like Wilson's take on Bruno was very informed by her. And I didn't understand how quickly interlibrary loan works. So I got like 7 books simultaneously with a 3-week deadline. So
Right.
I just had to pour through those books to get them back to the library to get them back. I sort of thought they would sort of dribble in, not understanding how efficient libraries have become. And actually, Michael Johnson has chid me for that I don't understand the power of libraries.
And Michael being the black belt Zen master of libraries.
Amen. And again, I think about this with Star Trek. The first Star Trek episode I watched when I was like 5 was the one about the library where they touch it and they go back in time to wherever the thing is. And Spock is stuck in this ice age with the woman who would later do the TV commercials with James Garner. And Kirk goes to the age of witch trials. But the incredible power of libraries. I think about a project. I don't think you joined us on that, but you're not on my Cleveland Illuminati thread, are you, of emails?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so I guess we were not in, this is, oh man, 11 years ago, I got a bunch of Wilson heads and we were going to try to astrally project back to save the library at Alexandria.
I remember a discussion about that, but I don't think I was on the actual thread.
And so interestingly, that again, Oz Fritz came at it from a practical occultist standpoint. Here's this book that E.J. Gold said is good on astral projection, boom, boom, and I had these musical texts for it. I also suggested we should go back to see who shot JFK. And I don't know that we had much practical matter, but the issue of libraries, and I think about, Sophocles wrote something like 44 or 84 plays, of which only 3 or 4 survive, because we used to have only single copies of things. And that is possible still in the 20th century. You think of, and this is something Gershom Scholem has written about, how the Nazis destroyed all these Jewish libraries. And a lot of texts were completely lost that were in Yiddish and Hebrew, because there were no other libraries than those ones in Eastern Europe. And one of the things Scholem was involved in was trying to save some of these libraries. When the Chinese invaded Tibet, they destroyed huge numbers of texts, and there were no other copies of those. And this is something, Israel Regardie differed with Bob Wilson about the optimism of Prometheus Rising. And one of the reasons that Regardie justified his publication of the Golden Dawn documents is he said he wants them to survive if there is another world war. He said somebody's going to have a copy of these documents in South America, et cetera, in case all the copies in America get burnt.
So something about just preserving information.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting. People sort of say, well, everything's available now, but you think about so many of us have wanted to read the uncut Illuminatus, was just gone.
Right.
The uncut Magnificent Ambersons. Okay, apparently that footage was there and was destroyed. I forget, it was because they ran out of space, or there was a flood at the studio where it was. And there's people say maybe there's a copy in some South American film library.
Or even Schrodinger's cat, when they went from the 3 separate volumes to the single volume, they cut out several hundred pages. So
Yeah, and
now
again,
you can go find the single volumes. I have copies of some old trade paperbacks, but in a way that's probably not, there's probably only so much of that out there.
and going back to the tale of the tribe, I really like the Pound scholar Peter Carroll. And he suggested he thought the most uncorrupted text of the cantos was the English edition before 1975, which I've never gotten a copy of. But I think about well-meaning editors, and Hilaritas has done such a wonderful job, but a lot of people want to go in and correct Bob's English. I have been guilty of this as well sometimes, but the problem is you might erase some of his jokes.
Right. We don't know what is a typo and what is an inside joke in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And you hit on, go ahead.
Oh, I think about that. There's a reference in, whatever canto is, Canto 13 by Pound, I think, where he's talking about Confucius and he calls him King Kong, because the Chinese version of Confucius is Kung Fu Tzu. My Chinese is terrible. And I thought it was a joke about King Kong.
Right.
And I remember mentioning that to a friend of mine studying Chinese. Oh, no, you could, no, couldn't do that. Confucius is too sacred. And I made the same observation to Carol Terrell, very important Pound scholar who headed the National Poetry. Oh, no, Pound never do that. I think Pound would make silly jokes sometimes. It would not surprise me. But, and this is where, again, the value of all these different takes on Wilson. I have my own tunnel vision of Wilson. He was much bigger than the person I knew. I didn't know him that well. We met a dozen times, corresponded, but the actual human being, the unpredictable human being who would ghost things and say things in different directions is much, much, much more than whatever he encoded of himself on paper.
Absolutely. And even what he encoded on paper, like to the extent I feel like I've wrapped my head around the 8th Circuit model, and I can talk about that all day long. When it comes to Joyce and Pound, I think I kind of get where Joyce is going and what Bob found interesting about it, but hell, I can't really speak to those things the way you can, for sure. I'm going to spin this a little different direction, or just kind of step back a bit, because when you were talking about preserving books, what came up for me is Digital McLuhan, the book Digital McLuhan by Paul Levinson. And the essence of that, as I get it, is that when the idea behind warfare is whoever controls the message can control the war. Certainly we saw that in Ukraine, where there was, if you're paying attention, you could see the propaganda for Ukraine, which maybe that's our side, so to speak. So we don't want to call it propaganda, but there was, plenty of propaganda pro-Ukraine, plenty of pro-Russian propaganda, even coming from the political right, but the point being is, like, who controls the information wins the war, so to speak. And apparently he has updated that book to correspond with the social media age. I think it's got a different title, but it's basically a revision of Digital McLuhan that he rewrote to fit with our kind of Web 2 social media age. I saw that recently. I haven't been able to track it down, but I would be fascinating to get his take on social media and how he sees that. But there's also obviously a lot of gatekeeping going on now that we've siloed our information into Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and this and that. And it's kind of created this more siloed and compartmentalized world that I don't think we were really expecting when it came to internet, or that's not what we were hoping for when we were cheering internet on 20 years ago. And again, I think when you start to combine this decentralized internet with a decentralized economic structure, you start to see the real potential of things here that haven't really been realized, because we're still operating on a monetary system that hasn't evolved in 80 years since the invention of the credit card, really. We're operating with a monetary system that the base code is COBOL, which is like pre-Fortran. I mean, oh my God. And it's still out there running today. You know, if you do a wire transfer, you kind of just, you're hucking money over the fence, and then you're calling up the guy on the other side of the fence. It's like, did you get that? I mean, this is 2022, people. We shouldn't be doing these sort of things. So anyway, I'm going off on my rant there. Thoughts? Anywhere you want to go.
And I forget where I read it. Maybe it's in one of the Sex and Drugs introductions, or Sex, Drugs, and Magic. Bob talking about optimism and catastrophe. And I think about looming economic catastrophes today, perhaps the end of democracy, etc. I don't know.
Okay.
I feel...
what is your fear? Because I think I might be able to
paying the bill.
First of all, fair. I do what I think I had this conversation with Michael Johnson a long time ago, and you were talking about Bob's future projections, and I was like, you know, Mike, some of this shit is just it's just over the top. And he was like, you know, I think Bob was really trying to create a message of optimism and hope. And I was, so that, I don't know, that just kind of hit me and made sense to me in a lot of ways. Like, okay, he's really trying to spread this message of optimism and hope. That makes sense to me. When I use that lens to look at his writing, then I can see, you know, okay, so some of this shit is over the top, but he's trying to promote he's trying to make us think out of the box and get hopeful. I get you're worried about paying rent. There's two books in the last 5 years that blew my mind. One of them is Eric Neumann's Origin and History of Consciousness, which is a summary of Jung, which I use to frame up the 8th Circuit model. And the other is a book by the largest hedge fund manager in the world, Ray Dalio. And he basically talks about, he started, you know, we have the business cycle, which is every 5 to 10 years, we kind of have a bubble and we have a crash, and then the economy builds back up again, and we have a bubble and a crash. And so every 5 to 10 years, we have this kind of short-term debt cycle that is referred to as the business cycle. But he noticed it wasn't just a repeating pattern, that it was really part of a bigger 80 to 100-year cycle, a long-term debt cycle. And when he started looking at that in the big picture, he saw that really defined the rise and fall of nations. So, for example, the British basically were the top dog going into World War II. You know, the sun never sets on the British Empire. But really, it was the British were on the decline of their long-term debt cycle, and the United States was on just starting off the rise of their long-term debt cycle. And the United States had the strongest economy. We had all the gold. We won World War II, and we were the top dog. All the institutions that crystallized after World War II were designed to support the United States as the top dog. And behind that, I mean, it's all economics. People say, you know, the US dollar is backed by the United States military. True, but the military doesn't just appear out of thin air. A military is bought by the strongest economy. And all these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and then all this, there was a new world order, and it all crystallized around the United States. And what was underpinning that is that we were the reserve currency, that everything in global trade, or the majority of global trade, was conducted in dollars. And that gives, so that it becomes the world's reserve currency. And because all the trade is conducted in dollars. And I'm going off on my tangents here. But the short of it is that we're kind of on this decline. China's on the rise, but we're also in this new climate of technology. we're in this new climate of climate change. And I think we're going to see some surprises. If we followed the system as before, the United States might fade in the background and China would take its lead as the world's economic superpower and the world reserve currency. But I'm not sure that's the way it's going to play out. You had something to say there.
I think about Timothy Leary's obsession with Gravity's Rainbow. And Gravity's Rainbow deals with that hinge between a world dominated by Britain and a world dominated by the United States. That we have a major character, Tyrone Slothrop, who's part of experiments in psychological mind control, an American serving in Britain, who then explores post-war Germany. And I find it interesting. I really enjoyed Herman Wouk's novels, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which also deals in that hinge in a much, much more conventional narrative structure. But that, you know, and I think about, again, another exercise, Prometheus Rising, where Bob says to think about Athens at the time of the Peloponnesian War, Rome at the time of Ovid, Shakespeare at the time of England, and New York in the 1940s and California today. I think about those first few nexi are the center of Shakespeare's plays. Isaac Asimov wrote a guide to Shakespeare in 2 volumes. One was the Greek and Roman plays, and the other one was the Greek, Roman, Italian. The second volume is English plays. But then he has these plays dealing with ancient Athens. He has these plays dealing with Rome, particularly at the transition from Republic to Empire, with Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. And then you have all these plays set in the Italian Renaissance, and then plays dealing with the evolution of power in England. So that you could see Shakespeare as mapping this jumping Jesus phenomena going from Athens to Rome to Paris or from Renaissance Italy to London. And I also think about something you were saying before about communities on the internet. And I think about the community of jazz musicians in New York City during World War II, particularly at Minton's Playhouse, 125th Street in Harlem, where Thelonious Monk had the house band. And big band music was the music of the day. But a lot of these musicians would come after hours to Harlem, and we're developing this new music of bebop, people like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Kenny Clark. And Robert Anton Wilson wrote about how Artronine Artaud spent the war in an insane asylum. Well, most of the world was trying to blow itself up. These musicians were inventing modern music while the rest of the world was trying to blow each other up. And I remember when first getting on the internet in the late 90s saying, I wanted to find a virtual Mintons, okay? A community of people online who would help peacefully design these future realities, just as those musicians at Minton's created this new music. I don't know that I found that, and I'm no Charlie Parker, but
well, what come up for me is you mentioned jazz, and there's something about jazz approximating a decentralized universe that really strikes me.
Tim Leary wrote about the idea that jazz popularized quantum physics.
Oh,
the idea that you had this abstruse mathematics of a decentralized universe in Einstein and the quantum physicists, and the non-imitative polyphony of New Orleans jazz gave people a model for that. Where our universe is being simultaneously created by all of us within parameters of social and economic structures, just as you had in Dixieland jazz, and as it moved to New York with Louis Armstrong, you might have the trombone, trumpet, and clarinet all improvising simultaneously in a way that didn't step on each other's feet.
Right. And so as I must, when you and I talk, I think about the Grateful Dead. And one of the things that, on the surface, everybody put Garcia up on a pedestal, so to speak. But when you really listen to the music, you've got 5, 6 individuals of very strong personality, each doing their own thing very well, and somehow packaging that up together as a song. You have something to say, go.
And there were forces within the band. Jerry got pissed at Bobby for not just playing rhythm. They got pissed at Phil for not just playing bass. So that individuality was pushing things away, but it cohered in a certain way. And again, you think about the idea that things in chemistry are either pulling together and pulling apart. That's functioning in the Dead's music. I think about Conrad Holt, a friend of mine, complains about Phil Lesh's bass playing. And I say, I hear what you're saying. But by Phil not playing the conventional rock role, that helped make the Dead's music what it was.
Right. There's this creative tension.
And two other things. We have a direct connection with Minton's Playhouse here, in that the band, the Dead, I think, opened, or the great Miles Davis opened for them. And so they were like backstage studying Miles's electric band. Of course, Miles was playing with Charlie Parker. And Miles is an example of somebody, again, who lived through, he revolutionized music 5 times in his own lifetime as he lived through these changing technologies, etc. And a final point, I think about how you have this beat generation, which it's, at a certain level was 4 individuals: William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, Neil Cassidy, and Allen Ginsberg. They are very, very small, but then it becomes a big thing when Kerouac writes On the Road. It becomes a huge hit. Kesey decides to go across the country. His bus driver is Neil Cassidy. You've got the Warlocks playing for the acid tests.
The house
They
band.
loved Kerouac, and so they loved getting from Cassidy all these ideas about hearing about the beat generation. So the beats in some ways preforged the youth revolution of the 60s. And of course, the young lady who just testified before Congress is named Cassidy.
I'm not quite sure where you're going there, but I see Cassidy as this bridge from the beat generation to the hippie generation, for sure.
And the Dead song Cassidy is about the death of Neil Cassidy, and they had a friend who had a daughter named Cassidy.
Yeah.
And who's it? In the book Flashbacks, which I read when I was taking a contemporary poetry class, and I was struck by how many of the poets I was reading were doing acid with Leary in his book. But he was like, he had a lot of negative experiences with, like, say, Kerouac was much more on an alcohol trip and was somewhat opposed. But Leary loved Neil Cassidy. And for him, Neil Cassidy embodied so many things he was looking forward to.
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh, just one sec. Debbie?
Yeah.
I'm going to mute you first. One sec. Go.
No worries. It's interesting to me, and I don't know how to make of this, but I kind of came to LSD from an interest in Leary, who I kind of see as representing the East Coast of things, at least early on, and a big interest in the Grateful Dead and Ken Kesey on the West Coast. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but it's kind of the juxtaposition of those two things has been on my mind lately for some reason or another.
And who's it? The guy who's the official historian for the Dead, who wrote the book, I'm forgetting the name of the book now, but his book on the Dead, pretty negative picture of Leary. But it's interesting, he got his PhD in history and he wrote this biography of Kerouac that Jerry liked. And so they hired him to be the official historian for Dennis McAnally. Long Strange Trip is the book.
Okay, yeah.
And I was struck that a lot of things, I mean, I enjoyed the book, but it rubbed me the wrong way, especially his picture of lyric. But you do have this East Coast, West Coast dynamic. Yeah. Which again, we think, I think about when I talked about Pynchon and the idea of this westward moving consciousness. Okay. You can see that in the connection between Leary and Kesey, which you see in that movie Across the Universe. They don't really address it, but you see this glimpse of this older guy, bus driver, who's obviously supposed to be Cassidy, and they go, and I think it's, I forget, I haven't seen it for a while, but I think Bono from U2 plays the Kesey type guy, and they go and they see this guy who's obviously supposed to be the Leary type guy.
Yeah, I think unfortunately Leary just had that tarnished reputation. And even before all that, he's not portrayed favorably in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, where the pranksters go out to meet him. And actually, I discussed this briefly with John Higgs on the Hilaritas podcast, but they kind of portray Leary as this fuddy-duddy, kind of didn't want to party. They, the pranksters pull up, they want to, the party's in town, and they're like, no. And there was this kind of thing about how they were sick at the time or something. They were just, Leary wasn't feeling well. And I think it was Zach Leary went to go interview Ram Dass, there was a lady doing a documentary on the pranksters, I believe. And she went to interview Ram Dass and Zach Leary, and she brought up that whole thing. And Zach kind of started feeding the typical story of, Leary wasn't feeling well and this and that. And Ram Dass goes, no, let me correct the record here. We had just finished a 3-day LSD deep dive and we were exhausted. We had been tripping for 3 days and we were all ready to go to bed. And up comes the prankster bus out of nowhere. And we were just in two incompatible places. It wasn't the right time and place for that meeting to happen. I went off on that story and I wanted to go somewhere else as well, but I'm just going to pause and we can keep rapping here. East versus West. So I just had this conversation with somebody else, Gestalt and Fritz Perls. Gestalt psychotherapy is an interesting kind of thing. I liken it to the Discordian Society, where we say Discordians stick apart. There's several Gestalt institutes, but there's no governing body. So it's Gestalt institutes like to stick apart. And what you have is like the Gestalt Institute of New York, for example, is still kind of, Fritz started on the East Coast. And so a lot of these East Coast institutes are kind of what you would call early Fritz Gestalt phase. And then he made his way over and eventually settled into Esalen and became like the resident dude at Esalen, or one of them. And so there's a bunch of West Coast Gestalt institutes that are all kind of modeled around Fritz's Esalen days, and just kind of a more relaxed and Taoistic kind of approach to things versus the East Coast, which is a little bit more rigid and structured in its ways. But again, just two distinctions between East and West that continues to this day. That comes to mind as we're just rambling here. Anything top of mind? Maybe if we circle back to the beginning again, the idea is we're looking at Tale of the Tribe through the lens of the Bacchus Sog and what we might have gathered from these online maybe logic classes. Any thoughts as we're wrapping up here on Tale of the Tribe, or anything else we've discussed that you want to share?
I think of John Cage's quote, "I have nothing to say and I am saying it." And John Cage loved Finnegan's Wake. Robert Creeley wrote a book called "Was That a Real Poem or Did You Make It Up?" And I met Creeley at the Ezra Pound Centennial back in '85, along with Allen Ginsberg. And when I got Creeley to autograph that book, he says, he autographed it with a story about John Cage, saying, if you have to ask, if you don't know, why ask? So again, interesting, all these different threads and how embedded we have become in these. I wonder about your psychological background and thinking about a comment Tim Leary made about Gravity's Rainbow, about how he was amazed how much psychology Pynchon knew. But I remember reading something 2 years ago about how a lot of people were having odd dreams during the pandemic. And I had a couple dreams about Pynchon. I had a couple dreams about Ginsberg. And I just had a dream about, in fact, before I spoke with you on June 23rd, which was Robert Hunter's birthday, I had this dream about Robert Hunter and Dylan, and which led me to rewatch the Golden Thunder review on Netflix, which again has a ton of Ginsberg stuff. And of course, Ginsberg went to visit Pound. I met Ginsberg at the Pound Centennial. The word Golden Thunder made me think about the thunder words in Finnegan's Wake. And Marshall McLuhan's son, Eric, wrote a book about the thunder words in Finnegan's Wake. And of course, McLuhan was greatly influenced by Joyce and a little bit by Pound. And of course, that also shows up in Tale of the Tribe. So I noticed how this has struck my physical life. I traveled a lot visiting Wilsonian places and did my master's thesis on Wilson and Joyce. And it's even inhabited my dreams with these things showing up with dreams of William Burroughs, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms, what it means for the larger society, I think about Bob Wilson really idolized Bucky Fuller, and Bucky Fuller talked about losing weight so that he could live longer to help society survive. And then I think about the deconstruction of Bucky in this very critical recent biography that Tom Jackson just reviewed. 230 years ago, Catullus wrote, "You ask me why I love and hate, beats me. I feel it done to me and I weep." So it seems as though in some ways we are surfing these waves of change, and in other ways we direct them. And so, Timothy Leary in the 60s said, turn on, tune in, drop out. He later changed that to turn on, tune in, take charge.
Oh.
But of course, that later version has not entered the popular consciousness as much as his 60s version did.
Not at all. I probably heard that before and completely forgotten about it. So, yeah. Well, we talk about jumping Jesus and the acceleration of knowledge, but I don't see that as a linear thing or even a exponentially linear thing, if that makes any damn sense. I don't see it as a smooth path. That's where I get into punctuated equilibrium and the idea that there's kind of like lightning, or not lightning, but big jumps. And I think my rap I've been rapping on this for a long time, but I think we have the convergence of three different things going on here. We're having a technological revolution. We're having an economic revolution. And I think we're going to have a sociological revolution driven by climate change. The economic revolution driven by the debt cycle I spoke of earlier and shifting power structures within economics. The technological thing, well, I think we've got internet. I think we've got Bitcoin and blockchain technology. We've got automation. We've got artificial intelligence. We've got battery storage and genomics and medical revolution going on. So all of these are feeding into each other. So I think we're going to have a massive technological shift. We're having an economic shift. And then I think climate change is going to bring about a sociological shift where we all are just forced to band together. So my thesis has been that COVID has really just moved us into kind of this global Chapel Perilous, where Chapel Perilous kind of being that place in between worlds. We're having a massive paradigm shift. We're moving from one old paradigm to another, and we're in this place in between right now. Where the structures are breaking down, the old structures are breaking down, and the new structures have yet to form. And therefore, there's just a hell of a lot of uncertainty because we don't have that old structure that kept us safe is dissolving. So, or just, that old familiarity of this is how the world works is no longer working. And yet we haven't quite figured out what the new world is going to look like. So we're in this place of like, fuck. And it's scary and uncertain. And, am I going to be able to pay rent? That's a pretty legitimate question these days. Shit, I can't even afford gas. Go.
And I think about 6 months ago, third grade teachers all across America complaining that their kids were singing every day, "We don't talk about Bruno." But I don't know if they were thinking about the Tale of the Tribe.
I'm not following you, but
The song in Canto is a song called "We Don't Talk About Bruno." And my third graders were obsessed with it, singing it every day. And I belong to a Facebook group for third grade teachers, and across the country, they're having this every day. Students are breaking out the song "We Don't Talk About Bruno." Bruno is a character in the play who has the ability to tell prophetic things, and people are upset because he tells them these true prophecies, which, again, thinking about Giordano Bruno burning at the stake for suggesting that the earth went around the sun, and that other stars might have planets going around them, that again, the name really fit.
Yeah, how funny.